I do want to put the question to this side. Is there a level that this thing would reach where you would justify, where you would support military intervention?
Well, I think that if you saw an extraordinary collapse in the situation in Syria, if you saw the chemical weapons getting into Hezbollah's hands or Al-Qaeda's hands, then those exceptional circumstances would, I'm sure, cause the United States and cause its allies to think again. I don't think there'd actually be any difference between us on that. I think we're looking more at the situation today, whether it can be allowed to continue, and our very, very strong advice is that it can't.
Okay, another question. So right down front here. People who are farther back, I have a bias towards the front of the room because I don't see that well. So if you're vigorous with your hand waving, I'll see you, and I'm not joking. Sir, please go ahead.
Stefan Edlis. My question has to do with the Israeli-Syrian border. For the last 30, perhaps longer years, this has been the most quiet border in Asia, in Europe, wherever you can see it. How can it be in Israel's interest when the Assad regime collapses, the Sunni majority will become jihadist? How can that be in Israelis' interest?
Well, let me ask you, sir, if I can rephrase the question, because our motion is really what's in U.S. interests. Are you identifying U.S. interests and Israeli interests in this case?
How can that be in U.S.? And
okay, fair enough.
Amend the question. How will that be in U.S.'s interest?
Thank you. I'd like to put that first to the side that is arguing that the U.S. should have a dog in the fight in Syria.
I think that American and Israeli interests are identical, and they have been for a long time on the Golan Heights. And you're right. The curious, ironic thing was that the Assads kept the peace with Israel on the Golan between 1967 and 2 years ago. But the problem the Israelis have now strategically is that Assad regime is significantly weakened. And it looks like, Assad's had some tactical victories in the last couple of months. He suffered 2 defeats in the last week. He cannot control his country any longer. So the Israelis can't bank on that. What we have to hope is that moderate elements in the Syrian opposition will emerge victorious, the kind of people who will understand they have to keep the peace with Israel as well in the future. That's the basis, I think, of what President Obama is trying to do.
Richard, do you want to take that? I'm only asking because we haven't heard from you in a bit, or you can cede to your partner.
Let me just do a short answer.
Graham Allison.
It's a great question. I was talking to one of the leaders in the Israeli national security community, who's a good friend of mine, last week. And so I asked him, just to your question, does Israel have a dog in this fight? And he says, absolutely not. Let's be clear. If there's a transfer of advanced arms by the Syrians to people who are fighting Israel, like Hezbollah, we're acting, and we're acting now. So Israel is attacked half a dozen times, particular instances of transfer. But he said, our official position and our operational position is we will not intervene in a civil war. That's the quote.
Another question? Ma'am?
I feel this has moved very quickly.
Could you just tell your name, please? Thanks.
Oh, yeah. Emma Ruby Sachs. I feel this has moved very quickly from dog to feasibility. So my question's about feasibility. You mentioned the peace talks which have been stalled. And to what extent can increased intervention from the Friends of Syria and the United States give both sticks and carrots to give Russia particularly an incentive to get Assad to the table and negotiate a transfer, which might provide some opportunity for those moderate elements?
Well, I think that particularly the United States have tried that with the Russians over a long period to get them to change their position sufficiently to get Assad seriously to the negotiating table. It hasn't worked so far. I'd have to say in the present state of U.S.-Russian relations, it doesn't look more likely to be successful in the weeks and months ahead. I fear that the only thing that will get Assad to negotiate or allow his team to negotiate is a change in the situation on the ground. And I think this is where we do differ, the two teams here. We're saying there are things that can change that situation on the ground. And the rebels say themselves they want more American and international support. They want the arms from the United States. They want the arms from Qatar and from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And they believe that with them, they can tip the balance, change the situation on the ground sufficiently to put Assad and his regime under pressure and start a negotiation. And the opposition in Syria isn't saying that Assad's, the whole regime cannot be part of a negotiation. They're saying we can't negotiate with Assad himself, but we're not going to do what happened in Iraq. We're not going to banish the whole of the regime, the whole of the army, the whole of the public service. We're going to negotiate with the people around Assad, form a transition, and then let the people decide.
All right,
and I think that's conceivable.
Richard Falkenrath, since part of your argument is that the undogworthiness of this battle is the impossibility of any of these things coming to being, or the near impossibility, what's your response to the scenario just laid out?
I think first, Nigel is correct that in order to get a negotiated settlement with Assad, you do need to change the situation on the ground. You do need to change the balance of military power in one way. In fact, it has changed in the last year in two ways. Hezbollah entered in force from Lebanon, and al-Qaeda entered in force from Iraq, not us. And so I think the basic diplomatic premise is correct. You need to shift the military balance in such a way that it is in their interest to achieve a negotiated settlement. Now, that's the problem with that, is that's what we call a proxy war. And so it is a recipe for entering a proxy war in Syria, not just against Assad, but against al-Qaeda. And so proxies are what we do when we want to change the military balance in a country, but don't want to be there ourselves. And so you are left with no alternative on your side of the debate if you do want to change the situation on the ground, but to engage in a proxy war in Syria, which the military analysis of which is not favorable to that case.
I want to remind you that we are in the question and answer section of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan, your moderator. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, debating this motion: the U.S. has no dog in the fight in Syria. I can go to another question, but Nick Burns, I don't know if you wanted to respond to Richard. I thought that I saw that you did. You're good?
No, I think
Go ahead,
Richard,
Nick Burns.
Richard has addressed the central question. Does it concern the United States that Iran is rising to power in the Middle East? A victory by Assad is a victory for the mullahs in Tehran. Therefore, it's in our strategic interest to push back. We choose not to push back with American troops in the ground. But if we can push back by weakening Assad and by supporting the moderates and making it more likely than not that the moderates will succeed and be victorious eventually, that's a defeat for Iran. So a lot of what we're doing here is trying to counter and limit Iran's inroads into the heart of the Middle East.
Sir, in the far back in the white T-shirt. White polo shirt.
Thank you. My name is Steve Began, and I have a question for both panels. We're obviously talking about a very complex issue that's playing out before us, but I think the real test of each of your positions is going to be in the outcome. And so what I'd ask you to do is look forward to a potential outcome. If your position prevailed, and we aren't talking about intervening or not, we're talking about degrees of intervention really here, I think, between the two panels. If your degree of intervention, if your position prevailed, what outcome within realism do you think would be most favorable for the United States' interests?
That's a terrific question. I'd like to put it first to the side that's arguing the U.S. has no dog in the fight in Syria. What policy prescription are you actually suggesting, and what's the outcome of that prescription, if you can predict? Graham Allison.
Absolutely great question. I would say that our hope would be, and the best hope, but it's a stretch, but the best hope is a situation in which the combination of humanitarian assistance to the victims and close working with the neighbors in the region and a strategic concept of a government that could exist after a transition leads to a negotiation in which there's a extended transition of power. And I would say that's a stretch, that's a distant hope, but the alternatives to that, if I look at them, are worse.
Other side, Nigel Schoenwald.
I don't think our recipe is fundamentally different. It's the same. I think our view is that has to be approached more urgently, and we need to put more tools on the table, get more involved, short of being sucked into boots on the ground and real military action. And the worry I have is that it gets much more difficult to see that political transition ending in a reasonable, representative Syrian government the longer this goes on. And the problem is that we've waited a long time. The extremists have the upper hand. And what you're saying, I think, is that we just have to accept that al-Qaeda and Hezbollah should slug it out. We say, no, there remains a distinct and credible moderate force within Syria that we have to support and get to the point where they can make their own decisions.
One more
Yes,
line,
Graham
'cause
Allison, yes.
I stopped, yeah.
Graham Allison.
I think Nigel is speaking directly to the point, but I would ask Fareed Zakaria, who's been struggling with this a lot, had a good line recently. And I wonder if you disagree. He says, quote, "We want an outcome in Syria that's even more ambitious than the one we sought in Iraq, and yet we imagine that we couldn't get it by a no-fly zone, or even less than that." So do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree fundamentally, but I'm just looking at the other comparable examples. And my comparable examples will be not ones that will be very appealing to this audience or to a British audience in terms of what we'd want politically. But I look at Tunisia, I look at Egypt, I look at Libya, I see all the reasons why it would have been very convenient to keep the old regimes in power, but I don't see Al-Qaeda in charge in any of those places. And I don't see why that needs to be the case in Syria either.
We're going to hear from Richard and then Nick. Richard Falkenrath.
A lot hangs on your assessment of the character of the Syrian state. One of the key differences between Tunisia and Egypt, to a lesser extent Libya, is the sectarian division in Syria is far worse. And so the speed with which the protest took off and the violence took off was not merely a moderate bourgeois rebellion against an autocrat. It was the emergence of a sectarian conflict which had been suppressed by force by the Alawites, a Shiite sect, for years, at least going back to 1970. And where the only other active political entity, the Muslim Brotherhood, was destroyed viciously by Assad and Hamas. So, I mean, to say that, to hang so much on the idea that a moderate Syrian secular leadership and consensus will emerge, as Graham says, we didn't even hope for that in Iraq.
All right, Nick Burns.
I think that Graham asked a fair question, and Fareed's a smart guy. The difference between the U.S. intervening in Iraq in March 2003 and what we're talking about now is that the Syrian moderates have a lot more support, frankly, than the United States did going into Iraq. If you look at Turkey's support and the support of all the Gulf countries, nearly every other Arab country, all of Europe, and the United States and Canada, I think that's probably the best way for this loose international coalition to succeed eventually in helping the Syrian rebels to stay together and to draw on that international unity. And remember, the question here is not whether we have a vital interest, not whether we're going to intervene militarily. We're not going to do that. Do we care who wins, and do we put our shoulder behind that side? That's what President Obama has said he wants to do, and I find that logical.
Right in the center.
Hi, my name's Lindsay Hanahan, and I'm desperate for some hope here. So we have a new leader in Iran, and I'm hearing this conversation about the proxy fight. Does the fact that we have a new leader in Iran give us some possibility? He's come up and said that he is willing to reach out.
Can you rephrase your question, and I know that you can, that relates it to what the American interest in being involved is?
If we're looking at do we or do we not have a dog in the fight, and part of that hinges on who that dog is that we're fighting as well, I believe. So I'm saying if who we're fighting changes in terms of this proxy, do we now have a dog in the fight if Iran pulls out and
who's on the other side?
who's on the other side
Right.
changes?
Okay, great. Actually, really well, skillfully done. Thank you. Who would like to take that side first? Richard Falkenrath, arguing the U.S. has no dog in the fight.
I don't have a crystal ball, but I doubt it. I doubt that the newly elected president controls it. It's long-standing. I mean, Syria is Iran's last friend in the region. Their support for Hezbollah goes back to 1982. Syria is the funnel through which the arms get to Hezbollah. And the new president is not, in fact, the supreme leader. The supreme leader is the supreme leader. And so this policy seems pretty well marbled into the Iranian state, and I doubt it will change of its own accord just because of an election.
The other side, Nick Burns.
I think it's a really good question. I don't disagree with Richard. I think he's probably right. But there is possibly an opportunity here. Rouhani was inaugurated last Sunday. He's a different guy Then Jalili, the former nuclear negotiator, the Europeans found him to be more pragmatic and straightforward when they dealt with him a couple of years ago. So we've been talking this week at Aspen, how should the U.S. approach him on this subject of Syria, on the nuclear question? We ought to give negotiations a chance. We haven't had a serious negotiation with Iran and sustained since the Jimmy Carter administration. So we ought to open up a conversation. We may not be able, probably won't, I think Richard's right, change their minds, but let's put Syria on the table. And let's let the Iranians know that this is a big deal for us and for Israel and for Europe, and see if we can make some progress there. It's at least worth a try.
That was a great question. Thank you. And sir, over here, and I think you might be our last question. Dana, do we have more time after this, or we need
My name is Arlie Sherman. As I recall, since I think I'm older than most of this group, that Harry Truman said that it was not in our special interest to defend the Korean Peninsula or the Straits of Formosa, and it was a green light for the Russians, the Chinese, and everyone to move. Are we not giving a green light now for Iran to move, and are moving and doing the same thing that Harry Truman did?
Nigel Sheinwald.
Well, that's our worry. I mean, that's one of our concerns over this continued stalemate. Letting Assad stay in power is de facto, it's a victory for Iran. It extends further their influence because they have thousands of their own people now in Syria in a way that they weren't a short while ago. And I think that, although I too agree that there's going to be very unlikely to be an immediate change on Rouhani's part, nevertheless, we want to create uncertainty in their minds, and the uncertainty that Assad may go and that something different may emerge in Syria, I think is a good thing in trying to get them to negotiate seriously with us on the other issues.
And Graham Allison.
Well, I would say in one word, no, okay? The situations are entirely different. There are numerous places in the world where the U.S. does have vital interests. There, usually we have an alliance. For example, Israel we regard as an ally. If there's an attack on an ally, we think this reaches the level of a threat to our vital interest. And for those, we are prepared to act. There are many, many other situations in the world in which we're not prepared to act. That doesn't mean that on some occasions we don't, and Korea is a good example. But it seems to me that if we went around everywhere saying to everyone, if something bad happens in Somalia, we're going to become involved militarily. If something happens in Sudan, we're going to become involved militarily. If something happens in Pakistan, where there's an even bigger war rate, we're going to become militarily involved. We will soon find the U.S. everywhere. Yeah.
And that concludes round 2 of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate.